Okay, picture this. You're 8 years old.
8 years old.
And you're translating Roman history
Wow.
from Latin. And I don't mean just like reading it,
Yeah.
actually translating it. That's what John Stuart Mill was up to.
Wow.
And he's the brilliant but like intensely educated philosopher
Right.
we're going to be diving into today, right? On the Mad Genius Thesis.
The Mad Genius Thesis, yeah. And you know what's fascinating about that? That wasn't like some, crazy like one-off thing.
Right.
That was Tuesday for John Stuart Mill as a kid. I mean, his dad had him on this, I don't know, like intellectual boot camp.
Yeah, and that's what we're really getting at today on this deep dive.
Yeah.
That possible link between like incredible creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And mental illness. And I mean, you really got to wonder, did this kind of upbringing, did it fuel his brilliance? Or did it come at a cost?
Mm-hmm.
And did that cost lead to his, later mental breakdown?
It's the question, right? It's plagued thinkers forever, right? Are brilliance and madness like two sides of the same coin?
It's like that the tortured artist.
The tortured artist.
But with John Stuart Mill, it gets even more interesting.
Yeah.
Because later, he actually criticizes his own education.
Yeah. Right.
And he felt like his dad, James Mill, focused so much on logic and analysis, right?
Right.
That it almost like stunted his emotional development.
It's true. It's almost like he was trained to be a thinking machine, but not really a feeling human being, right?
Have to imagine.
And that definitely feeds into this whole mad genius thing, right? Did all that intense like logic focus, did that lead to the breakdown, or was it something else completely?
Yeah. So let's get into the specifics here.
I
mean, we're talking Greek at 3, Latin at 8. Newton's Principia Mathematica by 11.
Right. I mean, I was still trying to figure out long division at 11,
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling.
It really is. And it was all, orchestrated by his dad, James Mill, who was like a hardcore utilitarian, right?
Yeah.
Believed in shaping his son's mind through just like pure logic and analysis.
Yeah. And that, that approach, it clearly, helped develop his analytical skill.
Sure.
Turned him into quite the debater, right? Even as a teenager.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, in his autobiography, Mill reflects on that, right?
Yeah.
And he's saying his father's emphasis on logic, it may have hindered his appreciation for things like poetry.
Right.
It's almost like he was missing something.
Yeah.
He even says, his education kind of neglected the poetic dimension of human life.
That's such a key insight, right? Because it speaks to this idea that maybe genius isn't just like raw brain power, right? It's about this emotional depth.
Right.
Capacity for like empathy, for connection.
Yeah. So was his mental breakdown then at 20, was that a direct result of, this emotional side being kind of suppressed?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I mean, it definitely played a part, right? I mean, Mill, he describes his breakdown as like this period of emptiness, right? Yeah. Where he felt like even if he achieved everything he ever wanted, it still wouldn't bring him true happiness.
It's like all that logic and analysis led to a dead end.
A total dead end.
Yeah, so we've got this brilliant guy raised on pure logic, and suddenly, it's all meaningless.
It's all meaningless.
Talk about an existential crisis.
Yeah. And this is where it gets, pretty interesting.
Okay.
Mill's breakdown, it wasn't just, a personal crisis, right? It was like an intellectual one, too.
Okay.
He started questioning the foundations of utilitarianism itself, right? The philosophy he was raised on, it's like he was waking up to the fact that there's got to be more to life than just cold, hard logic.
So what did he do? Did he just, ditch utilitarianism completely?
No, not quite. He found a new framework, and it was kind of in an unexpected place.
Oh yeah,
Romanticism.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
So the guy raised on logic and reason,
yeah,
is now drawn to the
emotional density,
the intensity of the romantics.
Though the romantics, that's quite a shift.
It is a big shift, and it speaks to his, his intellectual honesty. He was willing to challenge his deeply held beliefs and look for answers in new places.
Yeah.
And he realized that, that purely analytical approach, it was just too narrow. It was too limited to really capture the complexity of human experience.
So instead of just tossing his dad's philosophy,
right,
he tries to synthesize it with this new perspective, right?
Yeah, he's not looking to break away completely, but to kind of integrate these seemingly opposite forces.
To come up with a more holistic view.
Right.
That honors both reason and emotion.
It's like he was trying to, his head and his heart into alignment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that struggle, I mean, that becomes a major theme in his work.
Huge theme, yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to Mill's concept of autonomy. But before we get into that, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, Mill's criticism of his dad's economic position.
Oh, right, yeah. And it shows that Mill's break from his father wasn't just about like these abstract ideas, right? It was about real world stuff like wealth, poverty, and social justice.
So even though he was, brought up in this very utilitarian environment,
right,
where it's all about maximizing overall happiness, he wasn't blind to the potential downsides of an economic system that could leave people behind.
Absolutely, yeah. He was very aware of the potential for conflict between, entrepreneurs and the working class. I mean, this is the 19th century.
Right.
The height of the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of tension between, the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, so where did his dad stand on all this?
Well, James Mill, true believer in the free market, he didn't really focus on those social consequences, Yeah. He thought that, the pursuit of wealth, it would ultimately benefit everyone.
Okay, but John Stuart Mill wasn't so sure.
Not so sure. No, he felt like his dad hadn't considered, the social and moral consequences of that purely economic focus, how it could, almost erode the fabric of a just and flourishing society.
So he's challenging his dad's ideas, but not just intellectually, but also
on a practical
social level. Right. He's really grappling with the real world implications of these philosophical ideas, trying to figure out how to create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly, and that's where his his concept of socialism comes in.
Okay, hold on. Socialism, that doesn't sound very
I know
John Stuart Mill-ish.
It's not socialism as we think of it today. When Mill talked about socialism, he was talking about worker-owned cooperatives.
Right.
He believed that system, it could promote both individual autonomy and an economic fairness.
Right.
It was a way to give workers a stake in the economy,
Okay.
and prevent the kind of exploitation he was seeing in the industrial age.
So it's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to reconcile individual liberty and social justice. Like, he doesn't want to sacrifice one for the other.
Right.
He's looking for a system that works for both.
Exactly. And that's where you start to see his concept of autonomy, which we'll get into more, really start to take shape.
All right. So let's get to the heart of it then. Autonomy. What exactly did he mean by that? And how does it connect to his ideas about creativity, mental health, and even economics?
Yeah, great questions. Well, for Mill, autonomy, it wasn't just like, you can do whatever you want.
Right.
It went deeper, like more about becoming like a fully realized person.
Right.
He saw it as the goal of human development,
So it's not just freedom from constraints, but freedom to grow.
Exactly. And Mill believed that this kind of individual autonomy, it wasn't just for personal happiness, it was essential for social progress.
Right.
He argued that a society, if it stifled individual autonomy, it would also stifle creativity, innovation, and even moral development.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If everyone's just following orders, right, there's not much room for new ideas.
Exactly, yeah. He believed it was the engine of social progress. The more individuals were free to think for themselves, experiment, challenge things, the more likely society was to advance.
But how does this tie back to his breakdown?
Yeah.
Was he saying like a lack of autonomy contributed to his struggles?
Well, it's probably safe to say that his upbringing, with its emphasis on logic at the expense of emotion, probably didn't create the best environment for personal autonomy.
Right.
It was only when he started exploring Romanticism with its emphasis on feelings and imagination that he kind of broke free from that and found his own voice.
So his breakdown could be seen as like a rebellion against that lack of autonomy.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. And I think it highlights that autonomy isn't just some, idea. It's rooted in our emotional and psychological well-being. when we're denied, the chance to express ourselves or explore our own values, it can really impact our mental health.
And that's something that's often missed, right, in these discussions of mental illness.
For sure.
We focus on the individual, not
okay.
the social and cultural factors.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes Mill's work so relevant, right? I mean, he was writing in the 19th century, but he was dealing with issues we still face, the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility.
Yeah.
Searching for meaning in a changing world.
Yeah.
And the need to create a society that supports both individual flourishing and the common good.
Yeah. So how did he reconcile those seemingly competing values?
Yeah.
Individual liberty and social responsibility. I mean, he was for individual rights.
Yes.
But he wasn't saying, anything goes.
Right. No, he recognized that individual freedom had to be balanced with concern for others.
Right.
He didn't want a society where everyone's just out for themselves, he believed. True autonomy, it was only possible within a framework of shared values, mutual respect.
So it's not just being free to do what you want, but being free to reach your potential in a way that helps society.
Exactly. He believed that autonomy was essential for a just and flourishing society. He argued that a society that valued individual freedom would be more creative, innovative, and ultimately more prosperous than one that stifled individual expression.
But didn't he also say that capitalism, with its emphasis on competition, could undermine those values?
He did. He was a strong advocate for the free market.
Right.
But he was also aware of its potential downsides. He recognized it could lead to inequality, exploitation, and a kind of, materialism that eroded social bonds and undermined well-being.
So he wasn't a socialist, but he also wasn't like a blind advocate for laissez-faire capitalism.
Right. He was trying to find that middle ground, a way to, harness the power of the free market, but also deal with its negative consequences.
Right, and that's where his support for worker-owned cooperatives comes in.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, he saw them as a way to give workers more of a stake and to promote both economic efficiency and social justice.
It's like he was trying to create a system that encouraged individual initiative, but also promoted a sense of shared responsibility and social cohesion.
Yeah, it's really at the heart of his philosophy.
It is.
Right, this idea that we can have a society where individuals are free to flourish.
Absolutely.
But also contribute to the greater good.
Exactly.
All right, but going back to the Mad Genius Thesis.
Okay.
If autonomy is so crucial, does that mean that a lack of it can contribute to mental illness?
That's a tough one, and I don't think Mill would give a simple answer.
Right.
But I do think his experience suggests a connection between that lack of autonomy and a sense of alienation, meaninglessness, that can definitely add to mental distress.
So not a direct cause, but a contributing factor.
Yeah. It's like a seed that can become harmful if it's, in the wrong environment.
Right. If we're constantly told what to think and feel,
exactly,
it can really erode who we are.
For sure. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, even if they haven't had the same upbringing as Mill, right?
Especially in today's world, right? Social media, algorithm.
To conform.
Yeah, it's easy to feel like we're losing control.
It really is.
So how do we cultivate that sense of autonomy?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And I think it's one that Mill would want us to wrestle with, but his work offers some clues.
Okay.
He'd probably encourage us to, think critically, challenge what we're told, stand up for what we believe in.
But those are tough to do.
Yeah, it's not easy, but I think he'd say it's essential, not just for us, but for society as a whole.
Yeah.
He believed that valuing individual autonomy and critical thinking would make for a more just, a more creative, and ultimately a more fulfilling world for everyone.
Okay, but where does the genius part fit in here?
Right.
Is he saying autonomy is needed for creativity?
That's a great question, and I don't think he'd have a simple answer for that either.
Right.
But he did recognize that creativity needs a certain degree of freedom.
Okay.
A willingness to, experiment, think differently, challenge norms.
Yeah.
And that that is a form of autonomy.
But it's not that it causes creativity,
right?
But it creates the conditions for it.
Exactly. Yeah, like providing, good soil and sunlight for a plant. You can't force a plant to grow, but you can create the right conditions.
Right. Okay, so what about the madness part of this? Is he suggesting there's a link between creativity and mental illness?
I don't think so. He was too smart for that,
Yeah.
But he did recognize that creative people, they operate differently. They're more sensitive, more aware, more likely to question things.
Yeah.
And that can lead to, friction with the world.
So it's not that they're mad,
right,
but that they see things differently.
Exactly.
That can cause, conflict.
And in a society that values conformity,
right,
that difference can be labeled as madness.
Which brings us back to Mill, right?
Yeah.
He was raised in a very strict environment.
He was.
It didn't really encourage individuality.
No.
And it was only when he started questioning that, exploring his own emotions,
right,
that he truly flourished.
And that's the takeaway here, isn't it? That true autonomy requires that willingness to question, to challenge, to explore. It's not easy.
Right.
And it can be painful at times.
Right.
But it's the path to a more authentic, more fulfilling, and more creative life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot: autonomy, creativity, mental illness.
A lot.
The interplay of individual and society.
Yeah.
But we haven't really talked about Harriet Taylor.
Right.
I mean, she was a huge influence on his life and his work.
She was.
So let's talk about her. I mean, Mill clearly adored her.
Yeah.
Called her his intellectual equal, his inspiration.
Right.
But how much of his later work can we really attribute to her influence?
Well, that's a question that's been debated for years. It's hard to separate their ideas because they collaborated so closely. They shared so many intellectual interests.
It's like trying to untangle two threads that are woven together.
Exactly. Yeah. But what's clear is that Harriet, she challenged Mill. She pushed him to think more deeply about gender equality, the rights of women, and she helped him develop a more nuanced and empathetic understanding of human relationships.
So it's safe to say that she played a big role in shaping his later work.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because it challenges that traditional narrative, of the lone male genius.
Right.
I mean, Mill himself said his work was the product of collaboration, of dialogue, of a shared intellectual journey.
And that's a valuable lesson in itself, right?
Absolutely.
That creativity thrives in collaboration and support.
It does, and it's a reminder that genius, it's rarely a solo thing.
Right.
It's almost always the product of relationships, influences, inspirations.
So Harriet Taylor, she's another example of the importance of autonomy.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Right. I mean, she defied social conventions. She pursued her own interests.
She did.
And she challenged Mill to think bigger.
And it brings us back to that question of what it really means to live a life of autonomy. It's not just about individual freedom. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, to contribute their talents, and to, challenge the status quo in ways that benefit all of us.
And that's as relevant today as ever.
Right. Absolutely. And it's a challenge I think Mill would want us to embrace. He believed that a society that valued autonomy and critical thinking would be more just, more creative, and ultimately more fulfilling for everyone. And I think he would be excited to see us continuing that conversation today. Okay, so we've covered a lot: autonomy, creativity, mental illness, the complex relationship between individual and society. But before we wrap up our deep dive into John Stuart Mill, I want to go back to that first question we asked. Does Mill's life, does it support or challenge the Mad Genius Thesis? That's the question we're going to tackle in the final part of our episode as we look at Mill's legacy and what his ideas mean for us now. So as we wrap up our look at John Stuart Mill, that big question is still out there, right? Does his life, does it support or challenge this whole Mad Genius Thesis? Well, we can't forget that Mill himself, he went through that intense mental crisis, at 20. He even said, it was this period where he felt like nothing mattered. Right. Even if he achieved everything, it wouldn't bring him happiness. Yeah, it's like he built this incredible mind, but emotionally, he was running on empty. Yeah. Makes you think maybe all that
logic-heavy stuff from his dad. Maybe it backfired.
Right, and it wasn't just personal, it shook his intellectual foundations, too. He started questioning utilitarianism itself.
Oh.
That idea of maximizing happiness through purely rational means, it just didn't resonate anymore.
So did this crisis, did it somehow, spark his genius? Was this the price he paid for his incredible insights later on?
I wouldn't say it was a cause, but it was definitely a turning point.
Okay.
He realized that pure logic, the way he was raised, it didn't account for the whole human experience.
Right.
Like, he was missing a piece.
Yeah.
A way to connect his head and his heart.
And that's where, his exploration of poetry and Romanticism comes in, right?
Yeah.
He found something there that spoke to that emotional side.
Yeah, like he was discovering a new language, a way to express those feelings that had been, kind of pushed down.
And this new depth, that really played a role in his later work.
Huge role. It wasn't just abstract logic anymore. There was a human element there.
So maybe the breakdown wasn't the price of genius, but like a necessary step.
I think that's a much better way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, he had to break free to become the Mill we know.
It wasn't a cause, but a catalyst.
Right.
And it shows how important it is to nurture every part of a person, not just their intellect. Neglecting emotional development, that can have real consequences.
Even for someone as brilliant as Mill.
Absolutely.
Now, going back to that mad genius idea, are we saying his struggles were necessary for his brilliance?
No, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
What Mill shows us is that a narrow focus on logic and reason, it can create imbalance.
Right. It's like training for a marathon, but only working on your upper body.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to hit a wall.
You're not going to get very far.
Yeah, it's like he was this high-performance engine, but without, proper care, things were bound to break down.
Right.
And maybe that breakdown forced him to find a more holistic approach.
It's not that mental illness causes creativity, but that lack of balance, suppressing the emotional, the imaginative,
right,
that can lead to both distress and a stifled creative spirit.
So what's the lesson here? What can we learn from Mill, especially thinking about this mad genius idea?
I think the biggest takeaway is that people are complex.
Yeah.
We're not just thinking machines.
Right.
We have emotions, too.
And we need to nurture all of that.
To truly flourish, yes.
It's like that saying, all work and no play.
Right.
Maybe we need to update it. All logic and no emotion makes Jack a burnt-out genius.
I like that.
Yeah.
I think Mill would, too. He dedicated his life to bridging that gap.
Between reason and emotion.
Yeah.
To see the whole picture.
Exactly.
So if Mill were here, what would he say about this mad genius narrative?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think he'd be cautious about generalizations.
Yeah.
He'd probably point out that madness, that's a cultural label.
Right.
It can be used to, dismiss people who think differently.
He was all about individuality.
Oh, absolutely.
So I don't think he'd like the idea of pathologizing creativity or being different.
I agree, but I also think he'd acknowledge that there are connections, right?
Okay.
Between creativity, mental well-being, and the way society is structured.
Right.
He'd probably encourage us to create a world that values both intellectual and emotional intelligence, encourages different ways of thinking.
And supports those struggling with mental health.
Absolutely.
So it's not about romanticizing mental illness.
No.
It's about recognizing the full spectrum of human experience.
When creating a society that supports all of that complexity.
Yeah, and that feels very relevant today, doesn't it?
It does.
In a world that feels so divided,
Yeah.
Mill reminds us that progress, personal and societal, it requires embracing that complexity.
Nurturing empathy.
Valuing each person's unique contributions.
Well said.
So as we finish up our deep dive on John Stuart Mill, the question I have is, what can we to create that kind of world, individually and together?
That's the challenge for all of us. And I think Mill would be right there with us, cheering us on, pushing us to keep asking the tough questions, challenging the norms.
And working towards a better world for everyone.
Exactly.
And on that note, we leave you to ponder these questions.
Keep exploring the ideas of John Stuart Mill.
Thanks for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis.